Entonces, ¿habrá algunos latinos aquí esta mañana? Sí. Some Spanish people in the house this morning. It's so good to be here. You know, one of the things I like about that video that you just saw is as you look behind me on the screen, you see those 4 images. You know, the thing is about those 4 images that behind every single one of those images, there's a story. Right? And I think that in our lives, every single one of us, whether we've made a commitment to follow Jesus, whether we still haven't taken that step yet, it doesn't change the fact that we all have a story, and God so desires to be a part of that story, and He wants to use that story in our lives. No, and the truth is, I think that if we're going to be honest with ourselves this morning, we got to realize that story all too often, it looks like a roller coaster with the ups and the downs. There's the good and there's the bad. And you know, I don't know how many of you this morning have actually heard the audible voice of God, but I'm going to be honest. I've never heard the audible voice of God speak to me. And I think that so many times, as a missionary, as a person, as a man, as a dad, I think there's so many times I feel like I'm just kind of trying to feel my way through the dark, trying to figure out exactly where it is that God wants me to go. God, what is it that you want me to do? Where is it that you want me to go? And I think that there's so many times it's just so unclear. And I know that maybe you're probably sitting there thinking right now, but how in the world are you going to be a preacher behind a pulpit and say something like that? That God seems distant at times, that God is nowhere to be found. I love what Job says. In this verse, if we could skip one more slide, there's this verse he says in Job, he goes, if I only knew where to find God, I would go to His court. I would go east, but He's not there. I go west, but I cannot find Him. And Job, he doesn't stop there. He goes on one more verse. He says, I do not see Him in the north, for He's hidden. I look to the south, but He is concealed. If we could just skip back 2 slides because I missed one. It says that there's times when God's story, it's going to cause us to come home and we're going to be exhilarated through God's provision, through people and circumstances. And there's times when that won't happen, but I think a lot of times there are those of us this morning that would say that, you know what, I've had God speak to me. I've had God touch my life. And I'll tell you what, for me, I was in Bethel Christian Center, Blackwood, New Jersey, left-hand side of the church, 3 pews back in the middle of a worship service, hands lifted high. When I had this moment with God, that it was like no other moment I've ever had. I've never had it before and I've never had it since. But I had this moment where I just felt this impression from God speaking to my heart that He was calling me to be a missionary to the country of Cuba. And so what do? As I get older, I stand before the Assemblies of God, the executive team, and they're asking me, well, where do you want to become a missionary? I said, I want to go to Cuba. I feel like that's where God's called me. And they say, well, you know what? Maybe that's where you're feeling God's called you, but that's not where you're going. And it's not going to happen because it's a communist-run country. You can't get in there. We can't send you as a missionary. And to top it all off, you're just not ready. And so they go, well, we got another plan. What do you think about going to the country of Chile? And I didn't know anything about that country, but I said, you know what? If that's the door that God has opened, then that's the door that I'll walk through. And so that day, we accepted the opportunity that was before us to go to Chile, and we were the first missionaries in over 15 years, and we had great success, and we were working in the desert north where there were no other missionaries, and it was just a great time with opportunities everywhere. But deep in my wife's heart, there was always a desire. There was always a desire to work with women and girls who had been involved in sexual abuse, sexual exploitation, and human trafficking. But our natural inclination was to stay as far away from it as possible. But I'll tell you that in 41 years of life, what I've learned about God is that you never tell God never. Because He's an expert in putting us in those places that we said that we would never do. That's why I never say that I'll never do kids ministry. Because, you know, God might just stick me in that area. You know, but God, He's an expert at doing those kind of things. And so as our time finished up in Chile, we got a phone call. And they asked us, would you guys be willing to come back to Costa Rica to continue working in church development, but also in the area of human trafficking? You know, at that time when we got to Costa Rica in 2007, it wasn't uncommon to go into a restaurant like Spoons, which would be like a diner here in the United States in New Jersey. You'd go into a restaurant like Spoons, and there would be an old gray-haired American guy sitting with a young girl, and they could not communicate. They could not speak the same language, and you knew exactly why they were sitting together in that restaurant. And so when we get to Costa Rica in 2010, as I talk about how we come home and sometimes we're so exhilarated by God through provision, through people and circumstances, a report comes out in 2010 by the United States Department of State. And it lists four things about Costa Rica. Number one, it said that Costa Rica was a source, transit, and destination country for human trafficking. Number two, according to this report, it says that child sex tourism is a serious problem. And these aren't things that I'm making up. These aren't words that I put together. It's not what I perceived, but it's what the United States Department of State verbatim has said in their report. Number three, they said that still the government reported no efforts to reduce the demand for commercial sex. And then this final one is for us, where we're exhilarated by God's provision. It says, it was recommended the establishment of a shelter specifically for victims of human trafficking. And that was the very reason that we were asked to go to Costa Rica, to work in the area of human trafficking, and we wanted to establish a shelter. And it just so happens that in 2010, we find ourselves in the country, and this report comes out by the State Department. And you know, sometimes we're just so exhilarated by God, and we're like, God, but it's perfect. This is exactly what you're doing. This is exactly what you're doing at this moment. This report comes out. We find ourselves in Costa Rica. It just so happened that when we got to Costa Rica, God had prepared a woman 25 years earlier to leave the country of Chile to go to Costa Rica to work in the area of human trafficking. She started a foundation attending to ladies and boys and girls that were involved in human trafficking, and we start to make a friendship. And it just so happens by chance, if you want to believe that it just so happens by chance that she was from the desert north of Chile, where we were missionaries our very first term. It just so happens she's got this foundation. It just so happens we form a friendship, and she goes, I would have never worked with you guys had you never been missionaries in my hometown in Chile. And then finally, I mean, it just so happens then when we get there in 2010, this report comes out saying that the government is needing to do more to establish a shelter. And so when I say exhilarated, I almost see that as an understatement, because God's timing was just so perfect. But maybe you're sitting there this morning and you're looking at me going, that's great, that things happen that way for you. That's great that the pieces of the puzzle all fell together, and that God was confirming His word over and over and over again. You see, a lot of times when God speaks to us, it's not in a voice. It's through people. It's through circumstances. It's through things that happen in life. It's through us getting into God's word. And when I say exhilarated is an understatement, you just couldn't pay to make these things happen. And so we just felt like we were in this perfect place, but maybe you're saying, but that's never happened to me. All I know is life to be trouble and struggles and difficulties, and it seems like every time it happens, God is never around. And so I would say to you this morning that yes, there are those times when we come home exhilarated by God's provision through people and circumstances, but there are also those times when we come home and it feels like we're just falling into the deepest, darkest, ugliest abysm pit of despair. Like God is just nowhere to be found. And I remember, for us, it was almost as if the confirmations were just everywhere that we were right where God wanted us to be. Until one day we walked into a board meeting, and that same woman that God had prepared 25 years earlier came in with an agenda of her own. There's a reason why Proverbs says in chapter 17 that fire tests the purity of silver and gold, but the Lord tests the heart, because where much is given, much is required. And we walk into a board meeting that one day, and our whole world was flipped upside down. And she comes into the board meeting with an agenda of her own, and she wanted to dismiss the entire board of directors and get rid of pretty much the entirety of the staff in the foundation that day. And my wife and I had to make a decision as a couple, as Assemblies of God, to separate away from the foundation that day in that board meeting. And I'll tell you what, that decision was one of the most painful decisions we ever had to make. We were building a shelter. We had $175,000 invested, and we were just ministering. My wife was ministering to ladies, and things were just perfect. But in an open and closing of an eye, in a blink of an eye, that's how they say it in English. In Spanish, it's opening and closing. En un abrir y cerrar de ojo. In an open and close of an eye, things would just change, and the devil would just literally ravage our family and our house for the next 12 to 18 months.
Good morning, guys. For me, it was actually February 2nd of 2018 when I was awoken around 2 o'clock in the morning, and I woke up. I was in a full sweat. My heart was pounding. I woke my husband up and said, babe, I don't know what's going on. I don't feel well. I feel like I'm having a heart attack. For the next hour, every 4 hours, I was awakened that way, right out of my sleep. Around 6:30 in the morning, I made my way downstairs to the living room, threw myself prostrate on the living room floor, and began to cry out to the Lord and ask the Lord, what is going on? I couldn't stop crying. My body felt like I was having a heart attack. I was sweating. At around 8:30, I shot out a text to some fellow missionary wives that were my prayer warriors. And we had just that past November come back from a women's retreat where our area director that oversees all of the missionaries in Central America had a retreat. And she was talking about the 4 seasons of life that we all go through. And I realized back then at that retreat that I was in the season of winter. I was grieving over this ministry that we had to separate away from. And I remember that morning I shot out that text and I said, I need you guys to get to my house. I need you to pray with me. I'm not doing well. And I remember them sitting on the couch with me, and I cried for 5 hours straight. And as they sat there, they began to speak with me and say, Michelle, you need some help. You are going through compassion fatigue. You're going through burnout. You're in the middle of a depression. You're having panic attacks. You have anxiety. And I began to listen to them, and I kept saying, no, that is not me. That's not my personality. That's not how I am. I'm more upbeat. I'm an extrovert. I'm always laughing, having fun. And they were beginning to remind me of all of the things that we had just lived through in the past months. They said, Michelle, you just had to separate from a ministry that you poured your heart and soul into for 7 years. And you loved those girls like if they were your own kids. And within a matter of a couple of days, you had to separate. And I was never able to properly say goodbye to those women and ladies and those teens that I had grown to love. So for me, it was like a death. It was like losing a close family member and not getting a chance to say goodbye. And I remember them telling me, not only that, you just dropped off your oldest daughter at college and within 3 weeks had to be back to Costa Rica. Your family's still adjusting through that. Your husband has just been diagnosed with an autoimmune disease. We literally felt like we were getting slammed left and right and we couldn't catch our breath. And as I sat there, I kept thinking to myself, okay, maybe things have been really rough, but I just couldn't really face the fact that I was in depression. And I remember my area director specifically saying, you need to go to the doctors and you need to get some help. I remember the next day I woke up and I sat in the waiting room of that doctor's office, just feeling really raw, just kind of thinking, what is going on? And as the doctor diagnosed me, he said exactly what my friends had been saying. He said, Michelle, you're having panic attacks. You are having panic attacks and anxiety, and you are in depression. And as I look back at him, he recommended medication immediately. And for me, that was a big deal because I had grown up in a home where medication had been abused. I grew up in a home where my mom struggled through cocaine addiction. My sister struggled through a heroin addiction. I watched them abuse prescription drugs. So medication was never a thing for me. I said, no, I can't go down that route. It made me scared. I didn't understand. And that for me was the beginning of my journey with mental illness. And if you don't understand what mental illness is, please look into it. So many people today are struggling with mental illness, whether it be depression, anxiety, fear, panic attacks. They are real things, and they can ravage your life and ravage the life of your family as well. I remember looking at my husband when I got home from that appointment, and I said, I don't want medication. I don't want to do this. I'm scared. I don't want to go down that route. And he was struggling to keep things afloat, struggling to keep ministry going. And I remember within 3 weeks, my doctor said before I left, you'll be back. Within 3 weeks, I was sitting back at his office with insomnia. I hadn't slept in so long, could not sleep. And I said, all right, I'm willing to give it a try. And I'm not going to tell you that the fix was overnight. For me, it was trial and error. I had a lot of side effects at the beginning until I finally figured out how I had to figure out and pray through, Lord, lead me to the right medication, lead me to the right people that could help me. For 10 long months, I struggled and I kept getting worse and worse. I lost over 15 pounds. My family and friends began to notice. AGWM, Assemblies of God World Missions, began to get calls on our behalf saying something is not well with Michelle. She is not right. You need to pull her off of the mission field. And my area director flew back into Costa Rica and she gave me an alternative. She said, Michelle, two things. Either you're going to go back to Jersey, where I don't know what your health care is going to provide and if they're going to be able to help you, or we found a place in Florida where you can go and do a 30-day mental intake, an intake program where you can be for 30 days to properly get the help that you need. I remember sitting at my dining room table and thinking, you got to be kidding me. I'm going to leave my 15-year-old and my husband in Costa Rica and leave to the States for 30 days by myself? Has it come to this, Lord? I just kept crying out to the Lord, just heal me so that I don't have to go through this. Just take this away from me. And I'm not telling you that God wasn't big enough, but God had another plan for me. And sometimes we have to hit rock bottom. We have to go through those difficult seasons of our life so that God can teach us a few things, that we can learn a few things about why self-care is so important, why we need to look inward and heal those past traumas. When I got to that place, I broke out in a full hives. Never had hives in my whole life, but I had a full-out panic attack. I got there, and I was so scared and fearful of what that place would be like. And I got there and felt the Lord's presence immediately. It was a Christian place. And as I sat on my bed, I remember October 19th of 2018, I woke up that morning to do my devotionals, and I wrote in my journal, Lord, today you have restored to me the joy of my salvation. You brought me to this place to heal my heart. God, I now see that you wanted me all to yourself. I feel free today, free to dance, free to laugh. Yes, laugh, something that the enemy had tried to rob from me. It had been a long road, but you never, ever left my side. You even brought friends here to visit me, and you've been here all along. I wrote in my journal a verse that I had repeated for those last 10 months over 100 times. You will keep in perfect peace all whose minds are stayed on you because they trust in you. Isaiah 26:3. That's a verse I repeated over and over as they diagnosed me with PTSD, as they diagnosed me with depression and anxiety. That's the verse. You will keep in perfect peace all whose minds are stayed on you. So friends, I want to tell you this morning, I don't know what your struggle is. Maybe it's mental illness. Maybe you're struggling with depression or anxiety or panic attacks. Maybe you feel like there's no hope. This morning I'm here to tell you that there is hope in Jesus Christ. Do not give up. Our God is greater. Our God has answers, and it's churches like this that have prayed for us. So I want to encourage you to pray for your missionaries. Pray for your pastor and his wife and their families. We covet your prayers. The enemy would want nothing better than to take us out and take our families out. We are on the front lines, but I encourage you to pray for those in ministry, and don't give up in praying, because it's because of your prayers that we are still standing here today. Amen.
And so as that screen says, God's got answers. And all the time, God's got answers. Sometimes those answers don't make sense. Sometimes we don't understand those answers, but God's got answers. For me, it wasn't until the morning of June 8th, 2019, that I would really understand why we had to go through what we went through and why we experienced what we experienced. My wife wasn't the only one that was struggling, you see. We go through this storm, and I'm just trying to keep it together, right? I mean, my family, my wife, I'm losing her for a little while because she's struggling with what she's struggling with, and I'm trying to keep my family together. And after a while, I couldn't take it anymore, right? 20 years earlier, I had got hit by a bus. And so I have traumatic brain injury. And as guys, we don't really know how to connect with our emotions a whole lot sometimes. Look, I'm even worse because I got this brain injury and I get frontal lobe brain damage, and that shuts all of my emotions off. So I don't even know how to connect with my emotions. And so my wife, she's going through this hard time, and she needs a husband that's an emotional husband. And where is he at? He's nowhere to be found because the guy just doesn't exist. I mean, it's like all this is turned off in my brain. And so then we start to have marriage problems, and we're trying to figure out how to survive, how to make it work. I have to go to counseling. We come home to the United States, and the Assemblies of God World Missions are like, brother, you got to go do some counseling. I go to a doctor, and they're like, I think you need to get on some antidepressant medicine. And for a guy behind a pulpit, a preacher, to say that, look, I was on antidepressants, or I was going to a counselor, you're not going to hear that all that often. And it doesn't mean that I was a weak guy. It just means that, you know what? Life sometimes, as they say in Spanish, dura la vida. Life is hard. Durísima la vida, because life sometimes is just so very difficult. But you've got to understand that even when it's difficult, sometimes there's a reason that it's difficult. Look, sometimes we make it difficult, and sometimes God allows it to be difficult because there's something He's got to have us learn about. And so I think for you to kind of understand this, I think we need to take a look at 2 Kings chapter 4, and beginning of verse number 8. And it says this about Elijah. When we get it up on the screen there, it says, one day Elisha the prophet went to the town of Shunem, and there was a wealthy woman who lived there, and she urged him. She urged him to come to her home for a meal. And after that, whenever he passed that way, he would stop for something to eat. And so this prophet comes into town, and the Shunammite woman is like, what can I do to bless the man of God? What can I do? I don't have a whole lot. Maybe I can't really meet his needs all that much, but what can I do to meet his needs? And so I guess she maybe talks with her husband and says, hey, let's feed this guy. If there's nothing else we can do, let's give him some food every time he comes into the town. And so Elisha, he's grateful. He's talking to his servant Gehazi. Man, this is such an incredible blessing to be able to come into this town and know that this woman, whatever we have need of, she's going to take care of it. She's going to provide for us. And so he asks his servant, what can we do to bless this woman? When he tells him this in the next verse, the servant Gehazi says she doesn't have a son and her husband is an old man. You see, in Jewish custom, the worst thing you could be was a barren woman. Because to pass down the Jewish law from generation to generation was like the best thing that you could do. It was like your godly assignment in life. And so to not have a child, for your wife to be barren, was like the worst of the worst of the worst. And so the servant says, hey, look, Elisha, let's just pray over her and let her have a son. And so it says here in the next verse that Elijah gets to her, and she's in a doorway, and he goes, next year at this time, you will be holding a son in your arms. And this is the part I love. This is the man of God. This is the guy that hears from God. Everybody knows it. He's the prophet. And he tells her, next year you're going to have a son. And what does she say? She goes to him, no, my Lord, don't deceive me. Look, I'm not even asking you for a son. I'm not even asking you for a child. So don't go to that place. Look, you know how bad it is to be a woman and not have a child. And you're going to promise me I'm going to have a kid. Don't deceive me with those words. But the Bible says that at that time next year, she was standing in a doorway with a child in her arms. And I'm sure she was like, God's timing is perfect. God's got me right where He wants me to be. And then, all of a sudden, God doesn't make sense. But Bob, what do you mean? If we read a little bit further, it says, one day when the child was older, he died. But she even told him, don't deceive me. Don't get my hopes up. I'm not even asking you for a child. And you're going to give me a child and now the child dies? We never asked to work in human trafficking. We get this invitation and we go to Costa Rica and we go through all kinds of hell. And we felt like, my wife would tell you, it felt like that somebody in her life had died and something had been taken away. Something that she didn't even ask for. And so sometimes God just doesn't make sense. God just doesn't make sense. And so in the next verse, in 2 Kings 8:5, we jump forward a couple chapters. No, go back to that slide. We jump forward a couple chapters, and it says, at that very moment, and those words got a hold of me when I read it. Because what you don't realize, between chapter 4 and chapter 8, The boy dies. Elisha goes. He comes back to life. There's a famine in the land. And Elisha says, look, your son, he's back to life. There's going to be a famine. Go away for 7 years and then come back. And in this particular verse, 8:5, it says, at that very moment, because Elisha in chapter 8, he's before the king, he's sharing a testimony about a woman who had a son because God gave her a miracle. The son dies and comes back to life. And it says that at that very moment, Elisha is sharing the testimony when this woman walks into the king's palace. And the king looks at her, are you the woman? Is this really true what took place? And she goes, this is my son. It's this right here who died and came back to life. And it says in the next verse that he goes to his officials, I want you to see that everything that this woman lost, I want you to see that everything that she lost was restored to her. She went away for 7 years, had to abandon everything. I want you to make sure you give everything that she lost back to her. And so for us, it was June 8th, 2019. And because of the sensitive nature of what I'm going to share, I'm going to ask if we could just stop the recording here. And please, if you wouldn't put